Thanks to Miss Spudnut for helping with the funding for this video. If you'd like to have your own shoutout or get some special perks on the side, join the channel as a member today. These perks are also available through Patreon and Ko-fi, so if you'd like to stop there instead, feel free to do so. The links are in the description. I'm sure you all remember Nimona, right? I'm sure you do, as it was one of the biggest movie highlights we got from last year, and rightfully deserved too. You can definitely see where it shows, from the presentation to the production itself, and the production alone definitely deserves some praise from the drastic storm it was dragged through over the years. But what I never knew until its release was that this was originally put together, or arranged at least, by the one and only Blue Sky.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time.
I knew that name in the back of my head at some point, so I looked into it and then I remembered, oh man, they made up some of my childhood. Just look at these movies. I'm sure a lot of you remember seeing at least one of these titles in the theaters growing up at one point or another. Given how familiar I, and presumably a lot of us here are with these films, I figured I'd finally stop dipping my toes into the Blue Sky pool on the shallow end and just straight up jump in after so many years. But before going any further, there's of course some history to look through. So as usual, let's see how this came to be. So what is Blue Sky? Well, from what I've heard, it's one of the more modern social media platforms that seems more like a promising version of Twitter as time goes on. Oh man, that reminds me, I made an account for myself at one point. I gotta update that.
That's enough.
Alright, fine, I'll stay on track. To be legit, this studio's origin goes back a lot farther than I was expecting. All the way back to 1987. This was all built up by Chris Wedge and some of his co-workers he met through Magi, Mathematical Applications Group Incorporated. But then that company died out later on. Although the good news was that Wedge and his gang got the chance to use some of their software and equipment for themselves now. They started off by making a few commercials, but then their big break came around for them at the start of the 2000s. They were forming connections with 20th Century Fox, and this gave them more of the means to create Ice Age, which was the very start of their legacy. And from there, more movies came out over the years, all the way up until they got unfortunately bought up and shut down by Disney. So yeah, it wasn't the best outcome, I'll admit, but at least we still have all their movies to finally look back on, and hopefully an easy way to watch them. As this is the first video where we're discussing the legacy of a whole movie studio, it should be easy to tell we're gonna have a lot more on our plate than usual. So strap yourselves in, fellas, especially you, Jordan, as this might be the biggest video we'll have in the works. For this time around, we'll be looking at not one, not two, not even three, but 14 different movies, spanning over a 17, technically 21-year time span. Yeah, we're gonna have a lot to go through. So to keep this all a little more organized, I'm gonna have all these movies split up into different categories. Starting with the most obvious category, but still the most fitting, the Ice Age movies. The farthest Blue Sky went with any of their properties, and basically the movie where it all started. The original Ice Age was their first official movie, all the way back in 2002. One thing I should note before going forward was that despite growing up around this era, I actually never got to see a lot of these movies, including the Ice Age stuff. So it was a pretty nice experience getting to see this iconic trio coming together for the first time. Manny, Sid, and Diego, all starting off from very different directions and still ending up as good friends through it all. And that's even despite their hesitations toward each other at first, especially Diego, as he slowly goes through a development arc, slowly inching away from his pack and toward his new friends. Even Manny goes through some development, as it's implied through some flashbacks that he had a hatred for humans at first, originally coming from some torment that he had long before. But as this movie goes on, he starts to overcome that feeling, and he starts to gain more trust toward them for this new experience. And Sid's just, well, mostly there for the ride. The three encounter quite a journey, putting themselves through so much as they bring the lost baby back to his family. And I gotta say, with what looked like it was just gonna be nothing more than an average quirky comedy on the surface level, especially with Scrat all over the advertising, I never thought this kind of movie would have such a sweet story on the inside, but they still managed to pull one off. Seeing what kind of stuff the baby went through and the fate his mom got, man, I wasn't expecting them to go this hard on their first movie, and what we got as a result was a surprisingly touching story, with plenty of entertaining moments showing the writers and animators weren't afraid to have fun with this concept. So yeah, they started off with a pretty good hit, and it showed through the box office and reviews at the time. For their first movie, it was a pretty good mark, but then as the years went on they were making sequels which didn't really have the same vibe. I wouldn't say they were all terrible, but there was definitely a bit of a dip in quality as the years went on. Looking back, the first movie was essentially just a free play. They basically had the freedom to pull off whatever kind of story they wanted. As this was the first installment, there were very low expectations at the time, but they still blew many viewers out of the water with the impression they gave off from the storytelling and the characters. But now that they have an established world and characters, it would have been a bit more of a challenge from there, as there would have to be stories with a bit more direction and thought to keep the whole atmosphere stable and solid, instead of just falling apart with some crazy decisions. But like I said, the sequels didn't start off that bad. The second movie, The Meltdown, while maybe not as deep as the first movie, was still fairly decent and in some ways kinda heavy too. And that's because, well, everyone's starting to worry about the potential end of the Ice Age and what's to become of their land and even their own lives. And this time there was more focus and a character arc specifically through Manny, as he wants to believe he's not the last survivor of his species. Sure, we got a glimpse of his tragedy his family went through in the first movie, but that didn't mean there still weren't some mammoths around, and that's later confirmed as he comes across Ellie. It was a nice idea to include her, but to be honest, I don't really get her mostly. I wouldn't really say that's bad or good, she just comes off very confusing at times. Like, she'll go all over the place at different moments. And sure, some of her decisions are understandable, but then she might say or do something that could lead to a drastic change in tone. And sometimes as a result, it might not be clear who's entirely at fault for it, either her or Manny. Mostly it just feels like they'll make her change her ways or her feelings on a dime for practically anything, and simply because the plot demands it. But at least she does help Manny feel more value in his life overall, and seeing them together did help imply there were going to be some potentially decent elements to come with them as a pair, so she was able to help give some good substance in the end, despite everything else. And even though the villains here may not have been as impactful or even involved as what we saw in the first movie, they still left a fairly decent impression on their own, showing that the growing flood is their own high ground. The more water that comes in, the more of an advantage they have on their victims. Which also ties into Diego as he tries to overcome his fear of water throughout the story, and that's even with the time spent on everything else. I didn't think they'd be able to add overlapping arcs like that to this kind of story. And yeah, even if it was the only big example, it still helps the story add some layers to it, both along the serious side and some of the goofy side too. Speaking of which, this movie had a bit more of a noticeable push when it comes to the joking side than the first movie, as this time there are more side characters introduced simply for the sake of gags or somewhat zany personalities. And yeah, a lot of these jokes may have been predictable, but they still had a few that actually got to make me smile, with my personal favorite being the Vulture Valley. I absolutely love that they threw in an Oliver reference for it. I've gone into that movie a while ago, sharing my praise with it, and I never expected to find a callback to it here of all places. And I'd have to say, despite all the other pluses this movie had, that was definitely the scene that stood out to me the most. So while this movie may have had more to offer, when compared to the first, I still thought the first was slightly better, as there were bigger spans of growth the characters faced and the depth that was let out by them as the story went on, but The Meltdown still had some nice stuff going for it too, and I can definitely see why anyone would call it their favorite if they did. But we're not done yet.
Please don't put any dinosaurs in the movie.
Oh no! Dawn of the Dinosaurs was the third movie in the series, and here's where we start to see a bit more of a slip in quality for the story structure. The first two movies had a big journey to keep the story going, followed by a sense of growth in some characters and a decent share of jokes and comedy to help make it a bit more lighthearted. This time, however, they basically decided to go straight up overboard on the comedy and just make it some wacky zany outing. It kind of feels like the writers weren't too pleased with the lengths for some of these scenes, assuming they might be too short or something. So instead of just letting them play out in a montage or something to help keep them flowing regardless, they just crammed a ton of one-liners or just crazy moments in these scenes that bring the story to a halt while meeting the time length they were going for. But then again, I suppose that was to be expected since more of the spotlight this time was given the Sid of all characters. You know, the constantly quirky guy of the group who's mostly around for laughs, the one who's usually just there. And now he's being used to carry a heft of the plot's delivery on his own? What? So basically, the story centers around his first steps at taking care of babies on his own. And sure, the idea may sound cute on paper, but to make it enough to fill a whole movie? Now that was going to require some major stretching of the story. And not even Scrat would be enough to save all the gaps this time, especially since he was stuck dealing with his out-of-the-blue female counterpart through all of this, which ended up turning into just a generic love interest trope. And this noticeably affects his scenes too. You can tell that Scrat's scenes are way more frequent and stretched out when looking back on his screen time in the first two movies. Like yeah, this does give Scrat a bit more to do, but for someone who was only just a minor character up to this point, only to now have an insanely involved story in this movie all of a sudden, it can lead to a pretty jarring feeling. And speaking of the characters, there were some changes in the main group that I've noticed from the last movie. Unfortunately, most of these changes were not that interesting. Sure, some changes might be a little understandable, like with Manny, as you know, he's been spending more time with Ellie and he's about to be a dad now, but after what we've seen of him before, it just feels like he's lost a lot of who he used to be before without any real feeling of transition. It feels like we're looking at two different characters based on what we saw in the last movie and this movie, and there's no real sign of step showing how he really got to this point. Sure, you can probably lead to your own assumptions how he got such a huge change of character, but what good could that do? If you ask me, it feels like he lost a lot of his persona's grit we got to see from him in the first two movies, which I feel was the kind of thing to help him stand his ground and keep that big, strong impression that helped make him more interesting in the past. Aside from that, we also have Diego, who, just like in the other movies, gets his own special character arc for this movie too, although this one was kind of a step down from his last few developments. He went from experiencing redemption and friendship to overcoming fears, but now he spends most of this movie just losing his confidence. And even still, I'm not sure whether or not that actually was intended to be a character arc for him. It looked like they were setting up an arc for him at the start of the movie, but then when we get to what I can assume is the closure, it just comes off feeling so rushed. And given how quietly and irrelevant his confidence issue was played out for most of this, I found myself forgetting this was even an issue they set up for him in the first place. And I know some people will probably say these are just kids' movies and they shouldn't be seen so deeply, but remember, the first movie was written for kids in mind, and all throughout that, the writers were showing they didn't really mind being seen as deeply as they were back then. If they did, I doubt they would have gone as hard as they did with a lot of these scenes. But alright, that's enough of the negatives, let's go to more of the positives now. Like we've got the whole underground dinosaur jungle, and while it may be a confusing decision with just as confusing a story to it, the visual appeal on it can be incredible at times. The first glance alone was honestly really fascinating. Going from this dark frozen tunnel to suddenly everything's more bright and lively, and again, this is all underground. It may not make sense, but man, the contrast can be quite a spectacle. And even throughout, there are a few different shots and angles that can come off pretty keen in some ways too. Either with who or what's involved in them or how they're arranged in general. And some of the new characters can help liven a few of these scenes up too. Of course there's Buck, who shows to be very helpful in a lot of these situations. And he's even got a few brief moments that manage to crack a smile out of me. Which is more than I can say for a lot of the jokes in this movie, so it should count for something. And they went through the trouble of giving him a backstory too. I wouldn't really say it was important to let it out right away, but it was nice that he had one and shares it out regardless. And there's also the new baby of the group, Little Peaches. Though unfortunately, I can already tell she's mostly going to be used to extend the plots in the later sequels. But for now, it's nice to see her become part of the group. She alone shows how far Manny and Ellie have gone together. And I'm sure Peaches could turn out to be a potentially interesting character if the writers know which paths to put her through, though I can already imagine that might lead to some kind of big mistake. So while this movie may not have been as great as the first two, it still had a few things going for it to help make it slightly doable. It may not have been that interesting, but it was still a little better than I was expecting. Despite the slip-ups Dawn of the Dinosaurs had, I pressed on and got to the fourth movie, Continental Drift. And honestly, I found it to be more enjoyable than the last one. Still not great, but I had a somewhat better time than I was expecting. It was a nice touch to see the plot set up by a bit of realism, which also helps bring back some of that creativity from the first two movies. And I'll go more into that later. However, by using Scrat, the minor comic relief character, to make this disaster happen in the first place, that can come off as another big red flag. And it supposedly gets worse in the next movie, so I'll go into that there. Another factor in the story structure centers around the now older Peaches as she starts to face struggles in some relationships. And as you may have expected, Manny's got some of those obnoxious clingy traits again. Though I'll admit I can kinda see where he's coming from this time. as Peaches is now older and more likely to get herself into danger. So that makes sense. But can we at least see a bit more of this issue on Manny's side? Like maybe show us a flashback or a bit of his physical past so we can learn a bit more about his depth and his reasoning? Without that, he just comes off as an overly generic obsessed father type. And we've already seen that in plenty of other movies. If they only gave him a bit more of an explanation from his perspective, that could have helped boost his side a bit more. Think of Marlin from Finding Nemo. He was all clingy because he was unable to save all the babies and even his own wife. So you could see why he was that way with Nemo at first. Or maybe even Simba from The Lion King. He had that trauma from losing Mufasa, and we can see he had that same fear about losing Kiara. But with Manny, however, they never give us anything that really shows where he's exactly coming from. And as a result, it can be harder to remember a lot of the stuff he says and does anyway. Though on the bright side, Manny's starting to feel sorta like his older self here. I'm not sure how to fully explain it. Maybe I'm starting to warm up to this newer side of him. Or maybe Dawn of the Dinosaurs was just a fluke and the writers are starting to get their connection back with him. But regardless, that obnoxious side of him isn't really played out as much as last time. Though that's not to say it's completely gone, as there are still some eye-rolling scenes that feel kinda forced through him. But for his positives, the team leader role he gave off in the first two movies was very much present again in this movie, standing his ground for strongly supported reasons aside from his own, and not being afraid to call out others when they're being foolish. Now, those are the kind of traits I fondly remember from Manny's character, and it's nice to see that side of him starting to come back. And not only that, I found the villains in this to be surprisingly enjoyable too. They may not have been as impactful as Diego's former pack from the first movie, but the pirate crew here still had some decent heft to offer too. There was a decent variety of different animals in the crew, and yeah, they might not have the most interesting of personalities, but they can still come off visually appealing together at times. And they know how to put up a decent fight by outnumbering the heroes, and they can even give off some rather unexpected strength. Although I'd have to say a huge portion of all this comes from the main ape, Captain Gut. This guy was honestly a pretty fun villain. His interactions with his crew had their moments, especially the introduction song. His choice of design helped give him more flexible and energetic traits too, which made him a bit more entertaining to watch. His performance led to some pretty memorable scenes and lines, and they even got the Game of Thrones star Peter Dinklage to help boost his whole performance. Gut was certainly one of the more memorable, and in general, better villains we got from the franchise. But aside from those, the only other side characters introduced here were Sid's granny, who basically does nothing until the very end, when it's revealed that she's friends with a whale. Sure, why not? And then there's Shira, who... Oh no. Are they actually giving Diego a love interest now too? Sheesh. This really doesn't seem promising for them in the next movie. But overall, while this movie was certainly better than the last one, it didn't exactly paint the best light for the next movie. And speaking of, we should get around to what's basically the last big movie in the series run. At last we have Collision Course. Well, this one exists, that's for sure. Maybe I should have been as fed up with this movie as many others were, but after watching the whole series in such a short amount of time, I was just getting numb by this point. But despite all that, I could certainly tell this was the movie where the crew had practically thrown up their hands and yelled out, "Kids will watch anything these days, so anything goes at this point." Which really does drag the story down. And that's a shame, as this time the characters legit had more risk to deal with than ever before. Trying to save themselves from a huge field of asteroids? Yeah, sounds pretty heavy, no pun intended. But most of that heft goes away knowing that Scrat was behind all this. You know, the little squirrel on the side we're supposed to find funny and endearing, but now he ends up being the potential reason for all these characters being close to dying? Maybe it's just me, but that sounds like a mess of a layout. The character that started off as a simple gag now suddenly becomes a big cause of a lot of the suffering in the story. Even if it wasn't intentional, it can really be hard to ignore that factor. And speaking of the story, the pacing feels like it's all over the place, and in a rather sloppily planned way. For some scenes that feel like they're meant to lead to something important, most of that's abruptly cut or maybe just glossed over like it doesn't change anything, even though it really could've. Like when they find out Buck was lying to everyone about being safe and finding out they're all being stalked by those dinosaurs, and then they just shrug it off in the very next scene. And yeah, I suppose this kind of layout would make sense to some degree, as they all have the meteors and the volcano to focus on, but in that case, why would they pack all these details into the story if they didn't think they'd have the time to let them all have a more appropriate flow? Instead, they decide to pour a handful of their given minutes into a load of jokes that spring out with little to no build-up except for maybe a few seconds here and there, and yet the characters still try to play them off like they were so cleverly delivered. and that just makes a lot of them get tiring and really fast. And while that's happening, a lot of the elements that are more important are just easily forgotten about with the little time they're given. Like how Manny had a problem with Julian being for Peaches for most of this adventure. Yeah, that seemed like a pretty big element, but it was mostly brushed aside to save room for one of the many characters for a random gag. Though on the bright side, this arc does get some decent closure around the end. Although this movie does highlight another problem the series had by this point, the overabundance of characters. Sure, that was probably to be expected given how long they've milked the series by that point. They knew that by making new characters they could keep things a little fresher for a little longer. But this movie stands as a result of how it could easily go wrong. With so many different characters to focus on, you could easily forget that some were even there to begin with. Like, what did Shira do? Well, not much really, aside from mostly being a companion token for Diego, and even still it wasn't played off as anything that special. And that can really be played off for a lot of these other characters. Sometimes you forget Ellie's there, or sometimes Julian, or sometimes those obnoxious possums. You could tell they tried to squeeze way too much into the limit they were given. Well, then again, maybe the writers knew they still had some limit to them. I mean, they never dumped the love interest on Sid, so that's promising.
Well, hello, handsome. I'm Brooke.
Oh, for God's sake! It's times like this where I wish I just never opened my mouth. It certainly doesn't help that Brooke here is part of an out-of-nowhere sci-fi element where she and her tribe of ancient animals are kept immortal by the otherworldly powers from this asteroid. Yeah, you may think I'm screwing around or talking crazy or something, but no, that's a legit plot point. You can't make this stuff up. Even with a potentially big ranged and even big in general concept at their fingers, the writers just didn't seem to know how to entirely work with this. And in the end, what we're left with was a confusing, crowded mess of what basically ended up being the finale to the main story. That's a shame when you think all the way back to the very first movie. So looking back on these movies, I feel what made this whole concept work in the first place was the creativity from the limits they had back then. The first movie was a prime example of how sometimes less can be more. They wanted to keep things as realistic as possible, but still with a somewhat fantasy-like sense to it. The limitations they had certainly helped keep the story, atmosphere, and character set firmly in place. And they managed to give it their all with its simplicity. And what we were left with was a touching and quite enjoyable experience on different levels. Though thinking back to that movie, it does get me thinking, whatever happened to the tribe? Or at least the baby for that matter? How did they turn out after everything that happened in the sequels? Well, as I was saying, there's a chance you may have been feeling that creative writing and the touch of realism sort of fading away with each passing sequel. It may not have been as bad as in The Meltdown per se, but then there was Dawn of the Dinosaurs, and yeah, there was a pretty big fall there. Continental Drift debatably may not have been a whole lot better in the long haul, but they had some details that I found were kinda decent to help balance it out a little bit more. And I did still kinda enjoy Captain Guts after all this, but then we have Collision Course. And yeah, you could definitely tell they went off the deep end. There were just a ton of new elements introduced out of nowhere for these characters, and it didn't help that there was not enough time to really establish them. But even after all this, they still tried to run this franchise through holiday specials and side films and other projects now under Disney Say. But I feel we've gone on long enough with this segment, and the rest of the Ice Age stuff can make up a separate video at this point. As for now, we still have plenty more legacy to go through from some of the other brands, so let's move on to the other multi-movie story in the timeline, which were the Rio movies. Jumping back a little to 2011, the first Rio movie hit the scene. And while I wouldn't say I'm a huge bird fanatic or anything, I'll admit this movie gave an amazing presentation showing a lot of different species out there. It was certainly quite a visual appeal seeing them all with the different sizes and shapes, all while singing and dancing together. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention, this is a musical too. And sure, I've gone on a few times in the past about how much musicals can grab my interest, and this fits nicely into those. This movie had such a variety of songs to help boost the scenes and moods, and can come off really catchy and memorable. Heck, even Nigel's introduction song had its charm. Yeah, it may seem like just a cringy generic grab from a distance, but it does a good job in the details on its own, like summarizing his backstory, displaying his personality, or half of it at least, and it gives off a pretty nice jam as a whole. Admittedly, this is one of the Blue Sky movies I never really saw when it was new, but if I ever did back then, I can tell I would have had fond memories of the soundtrack and the songs if nothing else. So this movie basically follows that classic coming of age trope following Blue, who was originally from Brazil and, well, Rio. But he becomes domesticated after spending years in Minnesota with Linda, that is, until he meets Jewel, to which he gives him the chance to get way out of his comfort zone and start to finally develop his natural roots and interact with his birth habitat for the first time in years, all while trying to save themselves from Nigel and the smugglers by learning some advantages from each other's sides through city limits and the ways of the great outdoors, as well as help from other new friends in the wild. And while all this is going on, there's a whole side story for the humans involved too, as Linda gets to spend time with Tulio, which starts forming a pretty nice bond with each other, and eventually they team up with Fernando to give him a chance to redeem himself and break away from the criminal smuggling gang. See? This is the kind of chemistry that could have probably helped boost the Ice Age sequels a bit more. The kind of balance this movie had between the humans and animal stories could have helped broaden the variety, and help use some of the time that was taken by the filler. Though if there's one thing I feel could have been done better, it's the argument Blue and Joel had after they were freed from the chain. Sure, the build-up was arranged perfectly fine, but the delivery itself after that kinda feels partially rushed, which makes some of the anger feel a bit more abrupt than it probably should have. And even the way they resolve it kinda feels a little sudden too. Granted, a huge part of that is from Nigel's doing, so I can let it slide. And maybe if they gave this arc 1 or 2 more scenes, the flow would have probably come off a little smoother. But that's mostly just a nitpick on my end. The movie overall was still a pretty nice experience with likable characters, interesting story arcs, and a great adventure in general. And seeing all we get from this, it might make some wonder where the story could go from there. Well, that's where the sequel comes in. Well, as some may have expected, this was a bit of a step down from the first movie. Mind you, I wouldn't say it's as bad as the later Ice Age sequels, or even as bad on its own. This still wasn't as great as the first movie before it, though there were still some details I enjoyed from it. The first third of the movie was admittedly pretty decent. Sure, Blue and Joel's kids may be obnoxious on many occasions, but based on average kids' characters and other franchises, that was to be expected. And at best, this shows how much Blue and Joel have grown in family terms. Honestly, it's nice to see more of a parenting side to Blue in this movie. Or at least he turned out better than Manny did. And this whole arc in the first third had some interesting moments on the side, as they go through this big journey to the Amazon and they go through some exciting adventures and even run into some old characters, like Fernando, who doesn't really do much, but hey, it's nice to see he's doing well again. But once they get to the Amazon, the story starts weakening a bit after that. They learn about a huge flock of blue macaws out there, and incidentally being led by Joel's dad. Which sounds like it might have some potential to it, but then the arc just turns into an overly generic, desperately trying to show your worth to the in-law story, which really brings it all down to more of a drag. And on top of that, just like in the first movie, there's another big argument and resolution that, once again, came off a little abrupt in some ways. Only this time it feels noticeably more forced too, as Blue was legit trying to play by the rules and trying to make everyone happy, and he still gets scolded over it by just about everyone around him? Like, what? And even on Blue's side, you see him getting ready to leave everything behind without ever thinking it over. It's not until a split second after when he starts to think that maybe something happened to Linda, and that's what causes him to change his mind. Like, this all feels so much more rushed than in the first movie. But it's not all bad. You get to see the return of some other characters and how much they've grown, like Linda and Tulio, who are a lot more of a couple now, though their side didn't really lead to much either, except for adding the new villains. And they vaguely just want to cut down the rainforest. Like, yeah, it's bad, but wouldn't it be nice to know more about these guys? The smugglers in the first movie had some personality to show, which helped them stand out a lot more and made them more memorable. But what about the loggers or Big Boss here? What are they usually like? What do they have to offer? I don't know. And with nothing to really offer, I highly doubt anyone's gonna remember these guys. But on the bright side, Nigel comes back to add on to the villain side as well, and, well, he was kind of done dirty too. It's great we get to see him again, don't get me wrong, but man, after his wings got messed up in the first movie, he was just never the same. Yeah, his goofy evil side's still with him, so he's got some charm left, but as for his more threatening, menacing allure and that great strength he used to have, yeah, a lot of that's left him. Which is a real shame, as he had a great balance of those traits in the first movie. Having the chances to get close to killing his victims and giving off funny one-liners all at the same time? It all made him a really entertaining villain. Now we just have what's basically a revenge act that shoves him to the side, taking away a lot of the spotlight he could have had. Sure, his bond with Gabby might have added some substance to his end, but they still never made it far enough to really bring him back to his former glory. Still, this movie may not have been as bad as I was expecting, though instead it just came off forgettable for the most part. Definitely not the worst movie, though it's still not one I'd strongly recommend. But hey, at least we're now halfway through this whole thing. Pretty quick, wasn't it? Well, heads up, the next segment's going to be a much bigger marathon, as we're going to jog through all the one-off movies from the Legacy, which will pretty much take up the rest of the Legacy too. Well, all that's left are the remaining 6 movies from the studio. Technically 7, but that'll be for the next segment. Now, unlike the previous movies, these movies just stand on their own with no sequel. And depending on whether or not that was for the best will mostly vary for each movie, so we'll go more into that with each one we get through. Now, to get this one out of the way, we'll start with one of the more meh kind of films, being Epic. It doesn't really help that they went with a title like Epic in the first place, though from what I read, the title was at first going to be based around the Leaf Men and the story here. But then, behind Chris Wedge's back, the title ended up getting changed to Epic. And that's because, well, I guess they were just that certain the audience would feel that way about it? Though by that kind of logic, I'm sure they would have probably gone further with the title if they had their way. As for the movie itself, while the presentation and style may have some appeal, I still found it a little harder than expected to really understand the characters. Like, yeah, the good and bad sides were painted fairly obvious, but the characters themselves just didn't seem to have much to them outside of that. Though they do put in some effort to make this role come off as unique and creative as possible by having a lot of different features and rules, which is a decent step to showing some thought was put into this, then there are times when said rules and features are never really given the proper time to be shown or explained. Or sometimes they're explained too much and just never effectively shown. A lot of it just doesn't make that much sense at times. Which, you know, can be fine since this is a fantasy story, but they should have given a more proper unveiling to all the necessary details. You know, let it flesh out so we can feel more for these people and things. But instead, when a lot of details needed, they just blandly explained and cut back to some of the obnoxious side characters for humor, and we're just supposed to understand everything that's happening on the fly? Though once you do get to understand all of this, what exactly are we left with? Mostly something that feels like it's following in the footsteps of Avatar or Ferngully. Which isn't bad per se, but it still makes it come off highly generic, especially when grouped with these films. But I'll admit, there were some details I actually kinda liked. There were a few somewhat neat interactions with the human characters, like MK for example, who on her own had some pretty decent potential as a character, even if we never get to see a lot of it. I mean, we do find out her mom died, and yeah, it's sad, but it never really plays into a lot of the story itself. Though MK's dad was probably the most interesting character in this story. He seems the right kind of determined to accomplish his unlikely goal, and he has a lot of variety in machinery and performance delivery, which helps him stand out a lot more than some of the other characters. And despite his fascinations, he has a few emotional moments too. Like, you can see through him that he legit cares for MK and wants what's best for her. And we also get to see where he's coming from as he starts worrying about his image when he fears everyone left him because of his fascinations. All this helps add on to his layering and gives him a more relatable side at times. There were even some shots in this movie that were visually appealing too, particularly with the deer or the night scene with the bird or any of those slower moving scenes where MK and Nod are riding animals together. It's like they knew how to set a more relaxing kind of mood with scenes like that. It helped lighten the atmosphere to something more comfy at times. Though still, it might just be a me thing, but I wasn't really feeling that much with this movie. I can tell it tried to be amusing and intriguing and, well, epic, but I didn't really feel much of it. I'm sure they would have probably done better if they had the chance to do a sequel for this and maybe had a second shot at the story, but at the same time, I don't really have that much confidence they could probably do something like that now. Overall, this is the kind of movie I'm sure some people out there may still like, but personally, I can't help but feel like I'm gonna have a hard time remembering this one in the future. Well, now let's move on to a film that I'm sure a lot of us found a bit more memorable, Ferdinand. I may not know what your expectations were like toward this movie going into it, but as for me, I already knew quite a bit about the original source. My grandma had the book as a kid, and she loved it growing up, to the point she would read it to me as a kid every chance she had. So of course I'm very much familiar with the story and could already tell how a lot of it was going to play out. But naturally, they had to throw in a few extra details to fit a movie's length. Though with that in mind, and with my long-term history with the original story, I found it really strange during my first viewing to see all these new side characters added to fill that length. The horses especially, as they don't really offer that much to the story. So as a result, they can come off really forgettable and unnecessarily obnoxious at times. But then you have others like Lupe and the hedgehogs. Now they were a lot more memorable as they provided a useful assistance for a lot of this. But then again, they too seem like a bit much at times. Though on the other hand, some of the added features actually did some pretty good stuff for the story. Between all the slapstick and jokes, there were those scenes that slow down and take the time to show the weight of circumstances from the separation and even loss of those who these characters were close to. We get to see them 1 minute, and the next, they go away, and all carrying the risk that we could have probably never seen them again. This also ties into the element they're trying to show through harm that could come from bullfighting. A lot of it plays out in a very powerful way that gave me a feeling I honestly never had before with the story. On the side, the characters themselves had some pretty good designs that fit with the style too, as well as some decent choices for the cast to play them. With a few members I certainly recognized. There was Gabriel Iglesias and David Tennant, and wouldn't you know that Ferdinand himself would happen to be voiced by, of all people, John Cena! I know it's usually his thing at times, but it can still come off kind of amusing seeing him playing a strong peace character alongside knowing his casual atmosphere that he's seen in. And a handful of these characters, either new or original, played out a lot like I was expecting. Especially Ferdinand, with his flower-loving, usually peaceful nature, and El Primo, who for most of the story cared most about his pride and image in bullfighting, which is kind of the same image I had for them as I was reading through the story as a kid. All these details together at their quality made a surprisingly touching version of the story. Sure, they never made a sequel for it, but that was definitely a smart move, as this was always intended as a solo story from the start, and the fact that they kept it like that further shows the care they had for the source. Though looking back on it, I doubt this would be something my grandma would tolerate sitting through, but I found this to be a lot better than I was expecting. It was a pretty nice telling of the classic tale, and gave a great sample of it for this generation. While not jaw-dropping amazing, I'd still say this was certainly one of the better movies we got from the studio. There were a few Seuss films that caused riots to raise, but this one however got quite a bit of praise. Though loved by everyone, I'd say it's up to you. I'm talking of course about Horton Hears a Who. Rhyming aside, this movie's a bit of a rarity. While I may have seen a lot of these Blue Sky movies as a kid, this was one of the few I actually saw when it was new in theaters. Like many others, Dr. Seuss built up a great portion of my childhood, and I loved a lot of these kinds of works. Well, aside from maybe Illumination. But thankfully, Blue Sky actually did a better job when they had their chance. They took consideration to make sure they were staying as on point of the original source as possible, all while not being afraid to take a few creative liberties that still fit with the environment. And speaking of, this was an instance where I'd say the comedy didn't feel as forced, given that, well, it's a Seuss environment, so there's usually plenty of room for zany material. And on top of that, the use of jokes and the characters together felt a bit more practical than from some of the earlier movies, as a lot of these jokes were neatly woven into the story. Well, mostly at least. And that's where I feel the movie kinda slips a little. For the most part, the movie does a pretty nice job trying to stick to the story. And if not that, then at least the characters and their environment when they decide to take their own liberties. But then we have some of those liberties like, well, this. Which, yeah, I know stuff like this was added mostly to fit the required time frame, and or they probably found it funny too. Though, as sappy as this may sound, a lot of the other details this movie offers, like the visuals, the interesting writing direction for these characters, and even the jokes I found more funny at the time, it's structured pretty well and can do a pretty good job holding the attention of the youth this was aiming for. Sure, the characters' stories and motives might be stretched out a bit more than some may like, and again, that had to be done for the length's sake. But it all still works and can make sense based on what we're shown from their perspectives. Horton's the only one aware of Whoville, so he's doing everything he can to save them. The mayor's aware of all the potential threats around him through Horton, while everyone else isn't, or plays ignorant for the most part. So he does everything he can to save everyone. The sour kangaroo doesn't believe Horton and feels this is a fantasy that can lead to problems for those around them, so she does everything she can to stop it. And Jojo has his own developing arc to gain the confidence to talk to his dad. They all work pretty evenly around each other. And the cast did great for these characters too. These were some fairly memorable performances given out from some pretty big stars, like Steve Carell as the narrator, Carol Burnett as the sour kangaroo, Will Arnett as Vlad, and of course, Jim Carrey as Horton. It was quite an experience to see the studio tackle a Dr. Seuss story of all things, and you can really tell there was some care put into this. A few odd choices, sure, but this movie was still more direct with its source than anything we've seen through Imagine or Illumination. And to this day, this made me wonder how some of the other stories would have turned out under Blue Sky. Because as some of you may know from the books, Horton had another adventure in Horton Hatches the Egg. And I'm not entirely sure, but I think there were plans to make a movie for that too, but I couldn't seem to find much on that. So I'm not sure how far they were going to go with that, if they were at all, and that's kind of a shame. Seeing the treatment they gave this movie and how it turned out, I can tell they would have probably done a nice job with that story too, had they been given more of a chance to give it a shot. So yeah, I found this movie as a nice treat back then, and it held up pretty decently over time. Again, it might not be the best example, but I'd still say it's one of the better Seuss projects we got from the century. You know, Now, earlier in this video's production, I was discussing some of these movies with others, and I was surprised to see the multiple responses saying how much they liked robots. Though looking through it now, I can definitely see where they're coming from. Much to my surprise, I found this to be one of the best aged movies in the bunch. One of the best aged in creativity, visuals, casting, humor, well, mostly anyway.
Hey kids, get a load of this!
And especially in the story. The whole plot here perfectly shows what could go wrong with companies that's best known for providing services and products for their society, but then gets overblown by corporate greed or mishandling over time. While yeah, what they show us is obviously exaggerated, this can greatly demonstrate the discouragement that any common dreamer might be going through, constantly being knocked down by what some top people find bigger or better. And we see all this through the hardships Rodney faces during his efforts to live up to Big Weld. Fender and Piper have a similar conflict on their end too, as they and their friends hate the idea of having to pay for these upgrades despite being constantly pushed in front of them. And like I said, the corporate effect here has a lot of examples shown that I think we can all relate to in one way or another. Mind you, it may not be negative in every situation, but there's still plenty where it could lead to some unfortunately irreversible problems. Think of any time you might have been late for an opportunity because the company behind it changed their policy without you knowing. Or think of any time a helpful part of something big was replaced by something you constantly had shoved in your face, and you might have to abide by the new way of living they're forcing on you, or you wouldn't be able to live comfortably ever again. So if it's something you probably couldn't afford or wouldn't be able to get used to, then you're kinda screwed. These are all examples that may have had some rough impacts on our lives at some point, and this movie does a surprisingly amazing job showing that. And remember, this came out in 2005. Here we are, almost 20 years later, and the story and moral can still hold up strongly in so many different aspects of an average person's life to this day. But okay, I think I've gone on long enough about the deep symbolism. Let's slide more to the entertaining side and the presentation. These characters were given some very creative designs, and all with some unique features to them. Whether it's choices of color, size, or function, just take one look at them and there's something to remember about a lot of these characters here. We also have a really fitting big star cast for a lot of said characters. There are a handful of acting legends here I fondly recognize, like Ewan McGregor, Robin Williams, Stanley Tucci, Jim Broadbent, heck, even Mel Brooks. And while listening to their performances, it really feels like a lot of these characters were written especially for them, simply based on how much their dialogue reflects their casual acting style and other characters they've played outside of this. And the characters themselves get a lot of interesting interactions from this highly creative, energetic, and memorable city setting. Memorable in both the good and the bad. And what we've got overall is a movie that really speaks to a lot of us through its visuals, story, and metaphors. It left a pretty big mark back then, and it seems to stay strong after all these years. Now this may have had a lot of potential for a sequel, but seeing how other sequels turn out through Blue Sky and even movie studios in general, it's still kinda likely could have led some problems if they actually followed through with it. Assuming they were even planning to make one in the first place. But seeing how far they went with Ice Age, I still think it's very much possible they would have gone there. Maybe it was a better move to leave this as is, but on the other hand, I have a hard time believing an environment as free-range and inventive as this could have been done as dirty. But then again, we've been surprised before seeing how bad sequels can go with their earlier movies, so there might have been the chance of some kind of crash and burn had they not been careful. And given how powerful this story comes off at times, that could have led to a greater risk of a retcon, but I digress. This was a surprisingly great movie, and I really wish I gave this one more of a chance growing up. Spies in Disguise was their final movie to get the official theatrical release, going back to 2019. And once again, this was one of those movies I unfortunately missed out on. Honestly, I was not expecting this to end up as charming as it did. Especially after watching the trailers at the time, I was just assuming this would end up being one of the dumbest things possible. Well, that, and I just felt like I was getting too old for the Blue Sky products too. And yet, this ended up being another movie that I found enjoyable in ways I certainly wasn't expecting. This movie's a lot like The Emperor's New Groove in a few ways, but instead of John Goodman and David Spade, this time we have Tom Holland and Will Smith.
Keep my name out your fucking mouth!
He's an overly aggressive leader type who's full of himself and gives the other a hard time, until the aggressive one turns into an animal, leaving him helpless and needing help from the other to turn back to normal and achieve his goal. And all while each character gets to learn more about each other through their interactions and experience in the process. They start to see where they're coming from and develop an understanding from each side, and they become good friends overall. This kind of structure can play out in a rather feelsy way at times and still deliver an amusing story with a nice balance to everything. And even given that Sterling stuck as a pigeon for most of the story, the jokes they had lined up in this scenario were nowhere near as bad as I was expecting. Admittedly, I was afraid at first that this was just going to be non-stop cringe and poor excuses to throw in talking animal side characters, but thankfully that wasn't the case. Sure, there were still a handful of awkward jokes thrown in, but that was to be expected with this kind of setup. If anything, this shows the writers weren't afraid to add some of these details, and a good portion of these were given decent timing to them so they don't overstay their welcome. So, that's nice too. Though, as some may have expected, some of these jokes just didn't land as well. Like that one scene with Kimura that was a bit much, to say the least. Yeah, I know that was for the kids, and they were more likely to find it funny, but the amount of time they put into this for the little reason behind these specific details just made it feel like it was coming to more of a drag than it probably should have. Though, to be fair, it wouldn't have been as deep in the cringe had the joke not gone on as long as it was. Like, yeah, we know he's fat, and naked. There's only so much time the joke can be given before it starts wearing out. But aside from that, I had a fairly good time with, well, pretty much the rest of it. Here we had a memorable adventure with some decent humor, fairly plain suspense, and some good weight to these characters that get you to feel a lot of what they're going through. If you haven't seen it yet, then this might be another of those movies you might want to sit down for at some point. I'd say it's worth a watch at the very least. And this might be weird to hear me say at this point, but I saw a lot of sequel potential here, specifically through Sterling. There was a decent starting portion of backstory given to Walter, so who's to say Sterling doesn't deserve the same treatment? We learn a bit about his experience with his last partner, and there's some kind of relationship between him and Killian, the mastermind, although not much is really revealed for these factors. And I feel like they really could have gone somewhere with this, so it looks like they had enough decent material to flesh out and make a whole other movie from. But then again, that was probably just happenstance. At worst, they could have been betting they were making another movie by slapping on a very specific cliffhanger to the end or something. Now that would have been quite a kick to the crotch, especially given this was so close to the studio's legacy closing the book. And had I known this was going to end up being Blue Sky's last big theatrical release, I probably would have been a bit more likely to swing around and see what this was like, and maybe use this as a chance to think back to their legacy over the years. Well, we have one movie left for this segment, and I think you all know what it is by now. What's been considered as one of the highest rated and one of the most beloved movies they gave to the world, the Peanuts movie. Sure, this movie might not be as big as some of the others here, but in this case, it really doesn't have to be. It's Peanuts. They always knew how to take an average scenario and make it into an experience with a lot of charm. Usually the sky's the limit with this franchise, and this was no exception. There's a lot for different generations to enjoy here, like the characters we all know well feeling so on point here. And not to mention a portion of these voice actors were also in the stage production of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, which just made the casting far more clever than I was expecting. That, along with recycling audio from the late Bill Melendez. And on top of that, they all give a healthy load of neatly delivered references and quotes for the older fans. And the younger viewers got some new attention-grabbing substance to help it stand out in a good way, like the experimental visual gags and storylines that fit in with this atmosphere. And there's also the stylized CG animation that we've seen in other works, like Sponge on the Run, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, or even the Spider-Verse movies. It may not be completely identical to those kinds of styles, but you can definitely feel a significance between them. The style worked in those movies, and it works here too. The story, again, might not have had a whole lot, but it's really fitting with the Peanuts atmosphere that helped them become so cherished in the first place. As Charlie Brown tries everything in his power to impress the red-haired girl, but keeps ending up going through one fumble after another. But then he gets his well-deserved happy ending. Meanwhile, we have Snoopy on the side writing his novel about saving Fifi from the Red Baron. This is still familiar stuff we might have seen before, but the more modern soundtrack with that fitting vibe and visual flow helped make this feel more special with its own appeal. But it still has enough of what many of us fondly remember from these characters growing up. All this makes a great balance and leaves a great staple for the legacy. I certainly had a great time with this movie. It's right up there with some of the more enjoyable watches I had here, like Robots or Rio or the earlier Ice Age movies. But
I'm not done yet!
it may look like we've gone through all the big movies in this legacy, and yeah, we did. But before we wrap this all up, I say there's one more movie that technically belongs here, and at the very least deserves some words too. Ah, Nimona. I remember her legacy like it was yesterday. 'Tis a tale of generations, built up from loyalty, redemption, discovery, changes of one's perspective coming into play, and above all else, camaraderie and companionship. We witness all this as Nimona gives it her all to clear the name of her new friend Ballister and help him prove to his people he wasn't what he seemed. All while learning more about Nimona as well, and even learning more about himself than he may have thought, and reuniting with Ambrosius Goldenloin along their way. This very tale seemed to have touched the lives of many over the years, as it was to be given its own movie down the line. But alas, this very studio had its plug pulled, and thus had the production shelved, much to everyone's dismay. It seemed like Disney, having their way in this scenario, wasn't intending on this work to ever live to see the light of day.
Objection!
Not so fast, narrator. While you're right, this movie's production had a very rough patch after the studio shut down, and yeah, it did seem like this movie was going to be cancelled for good, but then we jump cut ahead to 2022 when other studios like Annapurna and Netflix of all companies took over the reins. And they pushed through to make sure this whole journey wasn't all for naught. And now we all had the chance to see what they had in store after all this time, and my god, this was definitely worth the wait. Sure, I may not be that pleased with Netflix given a lot of their decisions in recent years, but I found this to be more of a step in the right direction. Yeah, it would be fair to call me out for including this in the video, as it technically wouldn't count as a movie in the Blue Sky legacy, since they never really had the chance to get it published or finished. But it was them that got this whole thing started in the first place, and in that regard, I feel their effort and hard work should not be forgotten. You can definitely tell there was a lot of love put into this movie. From the character designs and the animation they were set to, with the new additions that weren't in the original book but definitely helped the story in this way, the interactions the character had, and the story that was played out, and there was just so much that you could find really enjoyable. Though I found some details that I feel weren't as strong or came off a little confusing at first. And I'll admit most of the confusion came from the fact that I was watching the movie and reading the book around the same time. So some of the story differences were more likely to throw me off in that way. While some of these changes may have made sense, there were still a few that I couldn't completely understand, both big or small. And there were also some brief moments during production that might have aged a bit more than others, and it definitely shows. But I'd say a lot of this is evened out by a lot of the greater features this movie had, like the nicely performed cast, the balance of jokes and emotions, the structure of these characters, both design and story-wise, and the very unique and smooth-flowing animation. And above all else, I think what really made this movie so loved was the metaphors and representation the story held. Looking at how corrupt and extreme the director ended up being when it came to her views and her power when her desperation started showing, and trying to manipulate everyone to have her back and making others look like the enemy, all while breaking pairings between others as a result, these are all examples of details I'm sure we've seen from a real-life leadership in one way or another. It shows potential disasters that can lead to some heavy-duty damage and irreversible effects in some cases. Pretty chilling when you think back to it. And on the side, there are again the metaphors for representation too. There are those nice moments we see between Ballister and Ambrosius, and there are even metaphors coming from Nimona herself. Being a shapeshifter, she can take on a lot of different forms, which at first Ballister doesn't see as normal per se, and later on this goes into a journey of acceptance and finding yourself. Whether they're cleverly added to the story or more direct, these are all things I'm sure people might be familiar with when it comes to the LGBTQ community. And it's a really nice touch to see they share such a variety of examples here, mixed with an adventure of fun and action. And that's why I felt this movie, even if it's by a technicality, makes a fitting wrap up to this video. This movie, and the studio that started its production, feel like two of a kind in some regards. Looking at this movie as a whole, there are pieces of the substance that all feel like they're building up to one big reflection. A lot of them helping us to look back and remember the movies that the studio had during its legacy, even with their own advantages and disadvantages from within, but all having something unique that can be enjoyed by a lot of people. There was the energy delivered by the emotions that can really leave an impression you're likely to deliver for a long time, and of course you're likely to feel something from this, as this is what a lot of us can consider the happy ending. The big closure for the studios. It's like we're at the end of one chapter and a potential start of another. It's kind of poetic when you step back to look at it, don't you think? I'm certain a lot of 90s and 2000s kids had at least one movie from this bunch they absolutely adored growing up, and maybe still do nowadays. I had quite the enjoyment from a few of these myself. Definitely Robots and the Peanuts movie and the first few Ice Age movies and even Ferdinand. There was a great variety here. Maybe if you feel us out there had a movie you particularly liked, or maybe if you had one you liked, Zach, feel free to let me know. I always enjoy hearing the fondness people get from stuff like this through different perspectives. So anyway, in recent years I've been seeing Disney taking a crack at the blue sky work for themselves, though mostly Ice Age, and the results were kinda hit or miss. As far as I've seen, there was that Adventures of Buck Wild movie, and it really could have gone better to say the least.
Oh no.
But there's also that show Scrat Tales, which is a little more endearing, but I wouldn't say it's amazing either. Personally, I think I'll need more time to see if I can warm up to it. So at the moment, this new journey for all the Blue Sky products is still fairly young, but I can understand those who are concerned because, let's be honest, franchises that usually get transferred to new management seldom follow through. But Disney has so much more to experiment with. Given all these movies we've been through, there's a chance they might come up with some future installment for robots, or maybe a decent Rio sequel, or who knows what else. And maybe a few years from now they might come up with something from these titles that could lead to a welcoming introduction for these modern young audiences. But like I always say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we?